Welcome to another episode of Capacity. We're here in Novato, California with OMW Corporation. We have Joe Osborn, the founder and the chairman of the board, as well as the chief operating officer, Michael Langston. They make really difficult to make components for the private space and satellite industry. And they make some really cool stuff. We can't mention any businesses or any companies. We just got a tour today and they're doing some really impressive stuff. Welcome.
Hey,
Thank
Sonny,
you.
thanks for having us.
All right, so you started off your career building violins and writing software, and kind of meandered towards metalworking. Tell us about your beginnings. How did you come to create this business?
Well, yeah, the violins and such that's very early in my career, the high school days. I've always been interested in craft and building things. So I was also interested in music. So I got into, being an apprentice violin maker early on. I had a wonderful shop teacher in freshman year in high school, and was very into metalworking for building models, live steam locomotives and such as a kid. After that, I went to college. After college, decided I wanted to go into business, and so started actually a family business with my father in software. I've always been oriented toward high tech. Did that for 15 years. We built up a software company, which was one of the largest microcomputer software companies in the U.S., but not one of the top 10 or 20, more like the top 80 to 100. But it was a successful company. We sold it in 1996. And I had been a hobby machinist. I had a little kind of hobby shop in my garage and loved working with metal, loved working with my hands and such. So got a little bit of money selling off the software company. But as my wife and I started to have children and expenses started to be more of an issue, I realized I needed to create a viable business out of what was essentially just a little hobby business out of my garage.
I saw a picture in the lobby of you taking delivery of what looked like a manual mill or something.
Yeah, that was a Chevalier. That was a manual Chevalier, basically a Bridgeport copy with an Analam control. It was one of the retrofit Bridgeport CNC mills, just an open, Bridgeport design. But it had ball screws and CNC. You're reminding me, I went right around mid-1990s when we were selling the software company. I was interested in software. I wasn't, by the way, you mentioned writing software. I personally didn't write software, but we had some really wonderfully talented programmers in the company were actually writing the software. But I did manage, a company which had a lot of software people in it. And I knew quite a bit about software. So I went to a trade show, and CAM 3D modeling in CAM, packages like AutoCAD and such had been out for quite a while by the mid-90s, but solid modeling was brand new. SolidWorks was basically taking the CAM world by storm in the early to mid-90s. It had never really been done on PCs before, full solid modeling. And also packages like SurfCam were doing true CAM on PCs as well. So this combination of SolidWorks in the early mid-90s and SurfCam and to some degree MasterCam was something very new. A lot of shops back then were still, I'd say most shops were just programming on the controls if they had CNC at all. There were still a lot of open CNC mills that weren't fully enclosed. It was still a transitional period where the average machine shop had not been taken over fully by CNC equipment. So I saw SurfCam and SolidWorks and I realized right away that was the future, that running those packages like that on PCs in small shops like mine with, affordable CNC equipment was coming in from Taiwan, from Asia. I knew that was going to revolutionize the small shops. So that was kind of my path forward at OMW, which originally was Osborn Metalworks. I started my little business basically as a little machine shop in my garage, calling it Osborn Metalworks. There was quite a large Osborn manufacturing company out there already, and there were a couple other Osborn names out there. So I took the acronym OMW, Osborn Metalworks, and turned it into OMW, which later became OMW Corporation when we incorporated in 2003. So anyway, it started as that small organization and just kept building it.
Did you start with Aerospace from the beginning?
No, it was not Aerospace in the beginning. I mean, I was one guy in about a 16 by 12 foot home garage making stuff on a little Bridgeport CNC mill and just a manual lathe. No, what I got into, I wasn't really experienced enough machinist to compete strongly in custom machining even at that point. So I came up with I was a hobby machinist, so I understood what hobby machinists liked. And I knew there were some tools that weren't being produced out there that I found in books on building, live steam locomotives and such. So I started a line of little machinist tools because there I could take more time working out the manufacturing of them and not, the trouble with custom machining is you have to be very, very good at making different things quickly, every day a different something, making it quickly. And I wasn't really skilled enough to compete very well in that world. But if I had the time, I could work out manufacturing a tool really nicely and make a really nice tool and then, dial in manufacturing it fairly efficiently. So that's the route I took in the beginning. And then as I got better at it, I quickly moved fairly quickly moved the business out of the garage into a rented space. And I'd run into another fellow who was a much more experienced machinist who wanted to share space too. He was starting a business as well. So we actually shared some rental space together for a while. And I got better at doing custom work, and the custom work started to, over the first few years, become more profitable, and it was clear there was a bigger market for that. So I started to veer that direction. And then as I hired, the first employee I hired was actually an accountant, to take that burden off me. And then I started to hire machinists who were better machinists than I was. So, we started to improve the custom work, but again, there was very little aerospace to begin with. Our earliest customers were in, there was a local manufacturing company, actually a pretty big one, making pipettes, and they were manufacturing their own custom manufacturing equipment to do these custom molded medical pipettes. And so they would come to us with, hey, we're going to build 3 of these machines. They've got, 200 different parts here, a bunch of small parts we need made. They were great. And we would, it was pretty low volume, but fairly, moderately sophisticated parts. It fit our niche well, and we grew with them for several years. And then we tacked on additional clients that were doing RF things and such. By about, say, 12 years in, we were getting sophisticated enough I remember we picked up an Aerospace, an early drone company making drones that were designed for potentially military applications, but at the time it was mostly surveillance applications. They were just essentially very good drones for collecting data from altitude. And later on, that company was sold to Boeing. So we got into Boeing through that company we were making parts for. And then in the 2010s, I come from a large family. I had a nephew who was a PhD basically a PhD space scientist, and he was working in that industry. And so I talked to him, saw there were lots of parts, getting made in that industry as well. So we started to work in the commercial space industry. And in the beginning, we weren't even qualified for it. I remember going and visiting the company he worked for and seeing parts that I knew we could make physically, but in talking to the buyers, they were like, well, you need ITAR registration, you need a quality system. And, I didn't even know what ITAR was at that point. So I said, okay, if we get all that, can we quote on some of these parts? They were like, sure. So it took about 6 months to get some of the registrations.
But back in 2008, the private space industry was tiny.
Yeah,
Really,
it was
small.
tiny. And we were tiny. We were a tiny company. So it seemed big to us because they were a larger company than us.
And it was large enough that you wanted to make the investment in getting ITAR
yeah, it didn't
compliance.
take, it wasn't a very big investment in terms of the registrations and such. There was an annual fee. But the things that we were at that point investing in, like a quality system, it was pretty clear that that was going to be needed doing more sophisticated work. I mean, as a businessman, I knew that we wanted to pull ourselves out of a commodity business. It's commodity businesses are tough because you're competing essentially on price. And we wanted to be competing in sophistication, not directly on price. There's three in manufacturing, as you probably know, there's really only three factors. There's quality, price, and delivery. And quality is pretty much assumed. There are definitely different quality levels with the customers. Depending who you pick for customers, you can kind of choose what level of quality. But whatever level you choose, you've got to produce parts at that. It's expected that you will produce parts at that level of quality. Then there is delivery. Delivery is really kind of the key issue in custom manufacturing, because delivery is really difficult in the world of custom manufacturing. Getting parts out on the date that you say you're going to get them out is tough. Price is, just been doing this a long time. Price is always a factor. The market, it's what the market, will bear, and you've got to be cost competitive. There's just no question. If another client can deliver and produce the level of quality that the customer needs, you're going to have to be able to compete with them on price. So we just kept doggedly. OMW is a nose to the grindstone business where we are working hard every day on a whole lot of things that are necessary to get parts out the door. People sometimes ask me what the secret of OMW is, and I refer them to an old short story called The Old Master, about a master precision rifle manufacturer who everyone thought had some secret to his incredibly accurate barrels that all the Olympic marksmen would buy from him. And the whole point of the story was, at the very end, the young apprentice finds out that there is no secret. It's just being really good at a whole lot of things and doing a whole lot of operations extremely carefully and, with great caring. And that, I think, is, that's OMW's secret, if there is one.
So since 2008, the space part of aerospace has really grown really rapidly. I've met a lot of companies in my journeys that try to keep up and couldn't. They just couldn't grow their own operations fast enough. How have you been able to do that? Like, how have you been able to stay in tempo with the growing industry?
Well, first of all, you have to want to stay in tempo, and you have to, if you want to choose that industry, you have to care about it. I grew up, I think Michael did too, grew up in the age of Star Trek, the original series. I watched that as a child. I watched the moon landing, the first moon landing on a black and white TV. I still remember exactly where I was in Massachusetts watching it. I've always been in the night. It's hard to imagine now for people that weren't around in the 1960s, just how exciting the space industry was then. You know, the astronauts were incredible celebrities. Those rocket launches were major events in the 1960s. Watching them on TV, you know, it was an amazing part of the social fabric of America, the space program in the 1960s. JFK had, you know, said we're going to go to the moon by the end of the 1960s. A huge percentage of the U.S. budget was earmarked for NASA. What NASA was doing was absolute state of the art in so many technological ways. You know, technology today that we take for granted was driven by much of what was developed for the space program in the 1960s. So it was exciting. And I cared, having grown up in that era, I was kind of wired for the space industry. I really cared about it. But it's a very demanding, even today, it's still very innovative, extremely demanding. I saw a lot of companies drop out because they interpreted those demands as sort of unreasonableness, but it's not, because, you know, what the space industry does is extremely hard. And, you know, if you aren't demanding, you're not going to succeed. There is a deep level of integrity in that industry. I think you're talking about astronauts' lives. You're talking about, you know, launches that are hundreds of millions of dollars of, you know, of investment per launch. So you have to have an appetite for that. And I don't think it is the right industry for everyone. I think there's a lot of people that don't have an appetite for it. We've been doggedly pursuing that and, you know, just essentially changing OMW as we went along to match those customers. And, you know, I got to say that a huge part of OMW has been the employees that we have. You know, we see, I'll just say one other thing quickly, which is that OMW is a partnership. I think of OMW, and I think Michael does too, as a partnership corporation. It's integral to our strategy as a company and to who we are. Really, it's integral to our company culture that we're in partnership with our employees, with our customers, and with our vendors. And we have enormous transparency. That's another thing that some businessmen don't, you know, they want to keep the cards close to their vests. They want to, you know, they're not willing to share certain information. We, with those partner groups, our employees, our vendors, and our customers, we're basically almost completely transparent. I mean, obviously there's some areas, you know, personal areas and things you don't want to share data. But I think we are more transparent than 99% of the companies out there with our groups. And we see our employees, we see our vendors and our customers as true partners. Now, does that mean every customer wants to be a partner with OMW? No, there are customers that don't operate in a partnership-driven, you know, culture, and we weed out those customers. We have let a lot of customers go for that reason. The same thing's true with vendors. The same thing's true with employees. You know, they see it as I'm the employee, and you know the company is trying to take advantage of me, and I'm going to get the. You know, they don't see it as a partnership relationship, and we work very hard to make sure, since we're the company side, which is generally the sort of bigger, more powerful side, versus an individual employee. We try to make sure that each employee sees OMW as their own company, that they're part of this organization, an important part of the organization, that they have equity in it in different ways, and that they have control and that they have trust. You know, we see every employee. In the early days of OMW, I remember every employee had a key to the company, a key to the door of the company. And some of my friends who were business were like, "Why do you give everyone a key? Aren't you afraid that you're going to have stuff stolen?" And my reaction was that, no, I give them all a key because every one of them is like our security guard. It's like, I totally trust, none of them are going to steal anything. Well, they wouldn't be employees if they were going to steal something. So we've always had a high level of trust, and we trust our vendors and we trust our customers too. So anyway, that partnership is an important part of who we are.
So I was told when I was very young that having values and integrity is really important, but it gets exponentially more difficult as things get more complicated and as you grow anything, yourself or a business. That appetite for being transparent, for rising to the level of potentially unreasonable expectations from your customers, has that appetite been challenged ever? Have you ever gotten stretched so far that you're like, man, am I doing the right thing?
Well, there's lots of gray areas. If you just look at, for example, you can have a part that's really, really difficult. Okay. You could have a tolerance of a couple of tenths on, or several tenths. And sometimes those tolerances are on features that the tolerance really is too tight on. It might be a bolt hole clearance hole or something. So you might have run 100 of these parts, really expensive parts, and you're out by a few tenths on a bolt hole, clearance hole that has no impact to the customer. So what a lot of companies would do, I've seen it, is essentially not mention to the customer. Maybe they know the customer's not checking. Maybe they're supposed to check, and issue a report, a QA report on those holes, but the customer is not going to double check it. So they let that feature slide, and that feature doesn't affect anything. No one gets hurt in that sliding that gray area. That hole, they know that hole can have that tolerance and it's not right. And it doesn't hurt anyone. So they let it slide. Right. But in our world, it's okay to let that slide, but that is not your decision on the tolerance of that hole, right? From our standpoint. So you are going to tell the customer, hey, I've got 100 parts and we are out of tolerance on this hole, and let the customer, again, gray areas, right? The customer has a total right to say, remake all those 100 parts. We don't care. We don't even want our engineer to look at that. It's not nominal. You've got to remake the parts. And we would do that. But, this is real life. So typically what happens a lot is you say, okay, we'll remake all 100 parts. It'll be 2 more weeks. And they're like, oh, we need them in a week. We've got a giant project that's going to be very expensive for us. So we're like, well, is that hole okay? And then it kind of changes. Well, okay, we'll have the engineer look at it and issue an SDR, and we'll let it slide. But again, that dialogue, that honesty in what is happening. I remember something that happened years ago. We had we obviously job out a lot of, and in fact, we've done ourselves a lot of plating in the past. We had some, in anodizing, you often have rack marks, and it's actually in the spec. You can have these rack marks because with these electrolytic processes, you've got to have electrical contacts. You can have little areas that don't get plated, and in some cases, you'll figure out a way to cover them up with something that's. But in the anodizing business, a lot of times the anodizers will literally, because customers don't like to see those little rack marks, so they'll take like a Sharpie pen, and if it's black anodized, they'll mark out the little marks with a black pen. Well, we had an employee years ago who had been involved in plating, and he was, unbeknownst to us, he was marking little rack marks on a black anodized part with a Sharpie pen. Now, in the space world, that's a no-no, because you're essentially putting another substance, right? And you don't know what's going to happen in the atmosphere of a space, vehicle. That's up to the aerospace engineers, right, to make that decision whether that's okay or not. But we discovered this, and we'd been making these parts for years, I think. And this guy had been marking them for months, if not years. And we suddenly discovered it. And the customer had never complained. There'd never been any problem. These parts had gone, been used in real life many times without any issues. But so what do? Again, a lot of companies would just say, just ignore it. They'll never know. They didn't complain. They never noticed, just keep doing what you're doing. Well, we didn't. We immediately called the customer and said, here's what happened. We had an employee, unbeknownst to us, they were marking parts. We've corralled all the parts. We let them know the serial numbers and the part numbers that were affected. It created a huge, a huge hubbub with the client, with us. There were hundreds of parts that were affected, and there was a big sort of uproar over this for a couple of weeks while it all settled down. But I remember about 3 weeks or a month later, the customer coming back to us and saying, we really, really appreciated that OMW fessed up to this and came to us and discovered it. A lot of our vendors we don't trust would actually do that.
Yeah, if I could jump in.
Please do.
That particular experience was early on in my tenure here. And it was part of what Joe's describing as part of the maturation process. I believe that particular incident was the first time OMW ever had to do a corrective action for a customer, do an 8D worksheet and so on. So, in terms of how we've grown with the space industry, that's part of it. We were willing to do the things that it took to mature, to develop a real quality management system, to grow as our customers grew. Your last question was about, has our willingness to be transparent been taxed? And it has, right? And when I talk to a customer, or a new buyer for an old customer, I'll give them the talk about how we're more than happy to be transparent, but I always end with, and I expect you to be the same. And we're not always met with that. And it colors the relationship. We need to be working on the same principles, or else it gets difficult. It's all part of our maturation as an organization. We've grown tremendously in the last 10, 12 years, and that's allowed us to keep up with our customers. We've grown up along with the industry, is the way I like to think about it.
So dovetailing on that, it's really difficult to get someone with your background to join a small company, no matter how exciting it is or how fast it's growing. You have Joe, who has a vision about how manufacturing should be done, about meeting potentially unreasonable demands from customers, and also a set of principles that all together make it hard to operate and scale an organization. There's all these restrictions. And clearly, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. We share a lot of your same values. What possessed you to want to come to a much smaller organization that had much fewer resources, that had many more challenges and many more restrictions? And if you could tell us a bit about your background too, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, I came to OMW from United Technologies, where I come from a quality background. UTC is where I got introduced to AS9100, to a real quality system. I had previous experience with ERPs like SAP, and I'd already seen how a manufacturing process should work. And when I came to OMW, I'm not the best person to be in a large corporate environment. I loved the work I was doing, but I didn't love the environment of working for such a large company. And when I came across Joe, I knew pretty immediately that there was a lot of opportunity here. On my first day of work, one of my colleagues told me, he was still here, we still work together, told me, hey, well, congratulations on the job. Our biggest customer is moving all their parts to Malaysia. We have this new crazy space company that has, all these really, really crazy requirements that we don't know how to fulfill. So the whole place is falling apart, but welcome. All right. and it wasn't true. It wasn't, but it was a change. And you could see immediately that this was a company that had great potential. And for me, the salesperson was Joe. One of the things that Joe's always been really good at is expressing enthusiasm for what we do. And it's contagious. You had the interview, and I think my first interview lasted 2 hours or so. I came back a couple of days later. And just the level of energy and enthusiasm you felt for what was in front of this company was great. And I knew that there was opportunities for somebody like me to come in and be effective. Sometimes you get lost in the big company. And it just seemed like a great fit from the minute I walked in the door.
You alluded earlier to the fact that you've had to kind of remake your company multiple times at different stages as you grew. What was the first time that you realized that a seismic or systemic change had to happen, and what did you do? And
well, I mean, if you go way back, it was probably that I needed to move out of my garage, because for one thing, I didn't have 3-phase power, and lathes especially don't like single-phase power.
How much did your wife have to do with that?
Yeah, I don't think that was so much of an issue. It was just, we had like a gravel driveway. It was hard for, I mean, my garage was smaller than some of our machines now, so that was, the big change. But one of the things that I learned, I was in the software business for 15 years, and one of the things that I learned there was you need to follow the customers, and you need to follow the money. You need to look at where the money is, not because, and we're not, the goal of OMW is not to make a lot of money. I think when I was young, that was sort of seemed more important to me. But now that I'm older, there's only so many toys you can play with. It's really about how much time you have and what you love to do. And I think I love the craft of working with metal. I mean, the toys I buy are like tools for my workshop, and I still have my home workshop, and little home machines to use there. I love that craft part of it, and I love the industry we're in, and I like the customer relationships. I like the vendor relationships. We try to find vendors like Fulcrum that have a really good strategy, that share our similar values, that are good partners. So that's been, a hugely satisfying and fun part of OMW. And I have no plans to retire because or sell the company. Every single day I get emails or texts from financial people asking whether they'd be interested to sell the company or whether I'm ready to retire, probably because I'm the right demographic. They see an owner ready to retire and sell his company. But OMW is an independent organization. I don't see myself as an owner. I see myself as a founder and someone who promotes the company culture, and an investor. But the company is really an independent entity, and its goal, it obviously it has to make money. I mean, I can't remember I want to say Harold Janine, but it may not have been. There was a famous businessman that said, business is like a game. And one of the things about business is it's this incredible game that only has one rule. And the one rule is if you run out of money, they take you out of the game. And that's true in business. You do have to make enough money to survive in business, but just making money by itself is not a goal that drives a quality organization. I really don't feel. The most fun that I have in OMW is not, making more money than I did last month. It's having a better organization this month than last month and improving the organization. And the improvements don't have to be, buying a $1.5 million new fancy CNC machine. The improvements could be, a better paper towel dispenser in the bathroom, that's, because the old one's driving everyone crazy, or hiring that great new intern from Cal Poly or Berkeley or somewhere. It's those sorts of, all the improvements excite me. And I think it's very, very gratifying to be in an organization where those are the things that are driving the organization forward.
You've been here almost a decade now, Michael.
February, like 10 years, yeah.
A lot has changed, new buildings, new machines, a lot of growth. How have you done it? What have you seen 10 years ago as a newcomer, now as part of the establishment?
Yeah, 10 years is a while. And the change has been constant. It started the second week I was here. One of my first tasks was to help manage a supplier audit for what became our biggest customer. And we had started making parts for commercial vehicles in right around 2012, 2014, and 2016. We had our first supplier audit. We had somebody from NASA here, and it was the first time we became actually flight approved to make flight parts. And that was my second week on the job. We still work with the same people. They became our biggest customer. And seeing that relationship grow and the nurturing that it took to get it there has been really, really rewarding. And the change has been driven by the customer's needs. As their needs increased and we were able to do the things that it took to match their pace. I started in 2016. By 2017, we were AS9100 approved. That was a kind of a milestone marker for us. Putting in processes, hiring some of the first kind of skilled quality people that we had, above and beyond what when I started, we had one guy in quality, and he's still here. He's our quality manager. Fantastic job, world class at his job, but he was one guy. And seeing that department build, seeing us continue to add new equipment. My first few years here, we would buy one machine a year. Yeah. And it was really driven by task considerations as much as anything else. Last year we bought 6 machines. This year we've already bought 5. And seeing that pace grow, and it's just as the demand from our customers drove that. And we've built this class of managers. We've built this class of higher level managers, young people. You've met a lot of the young people that we have here who are kind of growing up in the business, which is so exciting to see. But part of it's that Joe's been willing to make that investment. He's been willing to assume the risk. And, we can do all we want, but if you don't have an ownership structure that's willing to put money into the company, if you don't have managers who are willing to take that money and do something effective with it, it wouldn't work. So a lot of things have had to work together to get us where we are. Some of the people that were here when I started really weren't able to scale with us, and we had to bring in new blood. Some of the people who were here when I started are still here and doing amazing things. But the change has been constant, and I think you have to, I don't want to say you either have to change or die, but if you're not evolving, if you're not constantly moving forward, I don't think you can keep pace with the world that we operate in.
During that time, do you see the changes that have happened kind of like a ship of Theseus, where the ship is the same, or is it a different ship, a larger ship, a more complicated one?
It's definitely more complicated, definitely larger, but the structure of it's the same. I think the values, the 3 things that I think of as our core values are be straightforward, be honest, and be transparent. And those things have not changed. I think that we built onto the house, if you want to, change the metaphor. But I think we keep building new rooms and new floors. But I think that the foundation has been exactly the same.
I have noticed that I hold back the company more often than not. And that sometimes when I hire somebody or make a change or pivot the company's strategy or execution, so it's not as me-centric, I can allow for a lot of people to grow and a lot of things to grow.
For sure.
Have you noticed things like that? And in what ways have you held the company back, and how have you confronted those things?
Yes, absolutely. I think as an entrepreneur, now you're in the world of the entrepreneur, right? You've got to be very cognizant of becoming, a critical path in the organization it becomes a blocker for the organization. And you've got to make sure you don't through ego or through, most entrepreneurs have a need to kind of control and to be the boss. And, that can be very important, especially when a company's small, taking control and such. But as the company gets large, I do remember, here's an interesting point. I do kind of remember the size at which where OMW grew to the point where a single person essentially couldn't keep all the transactions in their head. When the company was very small, we'd have like 5 jobs going. So it was like, I knew every job. I knew what machine it was on. I knew exactly what was going on, what was going to get shipped that day, blah, blah, blah. It was all in my head originally. And then as the company grew, more people started to hack out pieces of those components, and it got to, I remember getting to the point where, I really didn't know like what was going to ship that day or what we'd set up reports and such to get visibility into it, but it was no longer something that a single person could control. It was its own organization. And I think organism, I should say, rather than organization. A company, I think up at 20 or 30 people starts to become an independent organism, independent from the founder. The founder can still, kill this organism by stupid decisions or by pulling funding or, selling it off or whatever. But it no longer is totally under control of the founder. And then, we're significantly bigger than that now. So, you're tending this organism as it gets larger. And I think as it gets larger, the company culture becomes a primary driver of the organism. You've got to get out of the way, as the founder.
Yeah. For me, it's letting people do their thing. It's just as a manager when I, 7 or 8 years ago, I was running around and I was doing a lot of things. We had one person in planning, we had one person in purchasing, and, a small company wore many hats. It wasn't uncommon for me to spend a bunch of my day moving parts from one part of the shop to another. And there's a tendency to want to micromanage. And if you do micromanage, why should you do it if I'm going to do it for you? And, I think all of us have had to learn how to let go of certain things and let other people do the job. I think for me, it's the lesson that we learned from our customers. We have these young entrepreneurial companies that are doing these amazing things, building these amazing vehicles, satellites, and so on. And we've watched these young people come visit us with, a laptop and an agenda. They've gotten great support, great training. They show up here and they're amazing. They're amazing people and they do a great job. And watching that unfold from our customers has given me a lot of confidence in sending people like we sent to Fulcrum and letting them go, letting them do their thing and come back and bring it with them. Seeing the young managers we have, the young professionals we have, be given responsibility, take it, really care about it, and I think that's what's really driving us forward. Joe and I, if we have to do all the tasks, we're not going to get very far.
If you talk to entrepreneurs, sometimes they're sort of like, yeah, but if you give them too much freedom, they're just going to, play video games all day in front of their computers and such, and blah, blah, blah. It'd be touchy-feely company where nothing gets done. There is at OMW, number one, you've got to hire people that actually like to work, there, and that enjoy the work they're doing, because, if they hate their work and they don't like to work, they're going to look for every way, to not work, and you're never going to be able to, to corral them into working hard. So you've got to hire the right people. And then you do have to have standards, The trick is you don't want to dehumanize the employees by forcing them into some sort of trying to match some robotic standard, but you do want to, you've got to get the employees to realize how important their jobs are in the organization. Like, hey, the customer really needs these 5 parts shipped today. You don't say, I want you at that desk for the next 10 hours straight and don't leave it till those 5 parts get shipped. that doesn't make the employee feel good. But if you say, I know that you're the key person to get those 5 parts out today and the customer really needs them out. Do you think we can get them out? And then the employee will say, yeah, I think I can. I can do it, boss. And
we have high expectations.
Yeah, you got to have those expectations, right? Yeah. And then it's fun for the employee. It becomes like a game, yeah, I know I can do it. I'll get those parts out. I'll get, and then they get them out, and then you're like, hooray, you got, we got them out, and everyone celebrates. That's a fun environment, versus the stay at that desk until those damn things ship.
At this stage in a company's development, there's usually 2 forces that kind of plateau growth. One is either playing not to lose. You want to keep what you already have, and you don't want to take more risks. The other is not staying focused and trying to do a bunch of different things.
Yes, those are traps.
You guys have, I think, demonstrated amongst a lot of shops that I've seen, really have the emotional discipline to stay very focused, even against this, risk of being under diversified or of being really, really deep in one area. And you've also continue to have a culture where you're taking risk, where you're doing new things, buying new machines, trying new technologies, trying to reorient your shop in different ways to alleviate bottlenecks. How do you, as a management team, keep those 2 things at bay when a lot of organizations at your stage, it starts to erode the company?
Those are dangerous distractions. I have this analogy of this shiny object. I think of it as someone walking along and you see some shiny object on the pavement and you want to pick it up and look at it and play with it. And you go a couple more feet, you see another shiny object, you want to pick it up and you get distracted, right, by these shiny objects, and you start losing focus on your walk down the sidewalk. And the same thing's true in business. It helps a lot, I think. Actually, I'll promote the idea of older employees now. We talked about young employees, but age, I think, helps a lot in that regard, because you see, I see a lot of ways that I got distracted being younger. Jumping at what appears to be the latest opportunity is a big problem for an entrepreneur. They're in some business and they're like, oh, that business over there is bigger, better, faster growing industry. That being said, you do want to be in an industry that'll be around. If your industry's dying, that is a problem. But there's a lot of industries that are growing, that are good industries. So it's not just space, for example. And there's noise in the signals too, understanding where your industry is in the long-term growth signal and in the short-term noise. You may be in a 3-month downturn and it looks like the sky is falling. You've got to keep your hands on the tiller and keep steering if you know this is a temporary storm. And that comes with age too, is because you've seen those downturns before and you've seen the recoveries. It's typical with the stock market is always a great analogy there, because neophyte investors will sell out at the first downturn.
I think, Sonny, you used the word emotion, and one of our principles here is that the thing that we can control is how we react to things, and I think we're really good at that. Not that we don't have emotional ups and downs, but Joe and I are pretty good about checking each other and making sure that we're not making wildly emotionally based decisions. And I think that helps a lot. And it helps to have people that you can, get feedback from. So when you are being emotional, you're not making, you have somebody to tell you like, hey, let's slow down. Joe talks about the shiny object. We talk about that a lot, and even within the industry that we primarily operate, we've been offered many different opportunities. Hey, why don't you get into EDM? You guys don't do EDM. If you did EDM, why don't you do that? And we've gone pretty far down the road on some of these opportunities and chosen not to do them. And that singular focus, I think, has really helped us. I think if there was an opportunity that we could pencil out that made sense, that we would really strongly look at that. If it's not something we don't do, but we've really kind of jealously guarded our core competence. And what we do well is complex 5-axis machining at competitive pricing. We do that well. That's what's gotten us here. And, we could veer off into Swiss machining and add that capability. We could get into large machining, and there's opportunities along the way. Our customers say, "Hey, we like what you're doing over here. Why don't you do this too?" But I think that our choice has been to stay as focused as we can on what we do well and grow that. And I think that that's been it's worked out pretty well.
You do need a core competency, and a value add scenario for your own organization. But if you're partnership driven, one of our themes here too is that if you've got, like, if you say to yourself, let's get into screw machining, the first thing is ask your own purchasing people, do you have problems sourcing screw machining? Do you have, a lot of times they'll say, we have a great screw machine guy. He's cheaper than you could imagine, always gets the parts in on time. We don't get that, we're not a screw machine house alone, so we don't do that much screw machining. This guy's great. So you look at that and you say to yourself, great, we got a great partner, partnering with us in screw machining. Why should we do it ourselves? It's not about like cutting that guy out and trying to squeeze another 1%. That guy's obviously taking some margin, the screw machine guy. Whether you could actually make more money doing it yourself is an open question, because for sure, customers come to us for sure with enormous resources, with enormous in-house shops, with very good machinists on staff. And they, because of the ebbs and flows of their own business and their own priorities, they can't, they rather have us make the parts because they can't compete because they've got too many other things to do, or don't have the volumes, they don't have multiple customers. So they can't keep those machines running 24/7 like we do. You have to make smart decisions about what your core competency is and where to expand. It's no fun to be in an organization that's not at least improving as an organization, and you want to have an organization that's fun for both you as the founder or a manager and the employees. They want to have opportunity. And if you don't have an organization that's improving, you don't have opportunity for the employees.
Yeah, I think we've also gotten good at being argumentative. Right? I think we've learned how to argue well. I think everybody talks about making data-driven decisions, and we have plenty of that. But decisions can also be very emotional. You can have all the data in the world, but a lot of times you make a decision just based on your gut feeling or what you want. And I think we've learned how to be argued. The other part of being scientific, if you want to call it that, is the data, but also the argumentation, right? You have what you want to do.
Assumptions,
and I'm going to challenge
theories,
that. When I challenge it, I'm going to come with data, with information. I think we've gotten pretty good at that. We've overcome the decisions to buy like the MX330s versus MAMs. That was something that was debated for a long time, right? We need more tools, so we should have MAMs. And then I'll say, no, we need more spindles, and this is why. And those decisions, took some time for us to make. But organizationally, we're really good about including people in our decisions.
Yeah,
and we're really good about arguing it out and doing it in a way that everybody feels comfortable with the decision when it does get made. Not that we're slow, we make quick decisions.
Yeah, and they feel comfortable in that environment of arguing things out or discussing things. You need to remove the fear factor. People can't, if someone has a different opinion than mine, I want to hear it. I don't want them to be like, I better keep my mouth shut because Joe will get pissed off and fire me, or whatever. You don't want that environment in the company. You want bright young people to say, hey, why are you doing it this way? Why are you making this part this way? We've been doing it for years. Yeah, but I think you should do it this way. You want to hear that because they might be onto something. And you want that environment where you can discuss and talk, at the same time, you got to ship the parts every day. So you can't get lost. That can be shiny objects disguise themselves, so you can't spend all day arguing. At some point, you got to make a decision and just move forward.
Yeah. If you make decisions that, with all the best information you have and you make the decision quickly, if you're right 85% of the time, you're probably doing very well.
Yeah.
And if you take all the time in the world to make decisions, you'll probably only be right 85% of the time anyway. So let's move fast. Right?
Yeah. And it's okay to, we all make mistakes. We're all humans. And, I've had, young employees that have crashed a $25,000 spindle. You're not going to get fired at OMW for that unless you do it like every 2 weeks, for too long. There's an expected level of competency that you should have. But that being said, people do make mistakes. I've made multi-million-dollar mistakes myself, by calling out some strategy that didn't work long term, that cost a lot of money. So how can I get too mad at some young employee that made a mistake and it cost an expensive repair? You've got to be, that's the other thing is you've got to not be too much of a hypocrite and hold yourself to a different level than the other people in the organization or your vendors or your customers.
I'd like to finish by talking a bit about the future, this redwood sapling that you have that you're growing. Right now, you're bootstrapped. You have a relatively low debt load. You have years of backlog. You have all the demand that you could possibly want, and you're still buying equipment. But as you've kind of threaded through, not every employee, as great of people as there are out there, would be a good fit for OMW.
Right.
Not every vendor or every bank or every partner would be the right one. Not every machine tool manufacturer that is looking to develop some new features should come and talk to you, and not every aerospace company should work with you. What are the ideal partners for you? What are the ideal companies that you would want to make components for? Or what are the ideal people that you would want to have here? And yeah.
Well, there's two parts to that. There's the ideological partnership, people that share the value. But there's also the technical side of it. Like let's take machine tools, for example. You might have a company that has great company culture that very, very closely matches OMW. They're transparent, they're honest, they're great partners, but they're producing machine tools for the sort of budget side of the market. They're producing machine tools that are wonderful if you're a small shop and you're running, because a small shop can usually only keep a machine tool running a few hours a day. We're now, we're a 24/7, 365 shop. We're running parts on Christmas Day. We're running them on New Year's. We're running them on Ramadan. We have a very diverse workforce that is part of the reason that that's possible. So we buy only the very highest end machine tools made on planet Earth. And so that company that might be just wonderful from a cultural background might not be the right company from a technical background. They're just not producing a machine that's going to fit in our environment. So you've got to match all the factors in making those decisions.
In terms of customers, I think that there isn't a day. One of the exciting things about my job is that there's not a day that I show up for work that there isn't a new opportunity that crosses my desk. We quote a lot, and ideally for us, for the customers are those that do share our values, are willing to be transparent, communicate well, and so on. But we want the customer to have some upside. We might call it even handicapping. So it might be a startup, but we want to judge that customer is going to have some growth potential for us. We're not a company that's going to be really great for quick turn R&D kind of work right now. We do a lot of NPI work, but we're not like a protofab or something like that where we're just going to take a model and run a part for you. That's really not where we are. And in terms of employees, I think that we've had really great success hiring people over the last few years. And as Joe said, our youngest employee is 18 and our oldest is 82. We have a number of employees from like 65 to 70 age group as well. And that's really great diversity. And what most of them have in common is that they're smart, they're talented, and they want to be here. And for lots of different reasons. We have young operators we just hired who just finished community college programs who are choosing to be in this business and so excited to be here. And are just, you can just see them absorbing what they're doing every day. Those are the people that we want. And we're pretty good and pretty fortunate in our hiring. And I think essentially what we want is the customers who want to work with us, the employees who want to be here. And it's, I don't think we think that much about diversity in terms of industry segment and so on. We're pretty much stacked into the space world, but we just want those customers who are going to work with us and be here for a while.
Thank you guys for being on the podcast. Where can people find you if they want to reach out and say, I'm one of these perfect employees or vendors or customers?
Yeah. Different places for different things,
places. The best way to get a hold of us is an email address, rfq@omwcorp.com. That's monitored by a few people and we'll get to the right place. And they can always look at our website at omwcorp.com.
And also LinkedIn, we have a strong presence on. We've been using that quite a lot, especially recently. Just type in OMW Corp on LinkedIn or Michael Langston or Joe Osborn, or any of our employees for that matter. A lot of us there.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on all the success and best of luck going forward.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks for coming to visit.
Yeah.
Thank you.